once, and then he takes them to Caesarea Philippi, right, on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. But really, his work was on this 100-mile stretch between Nazareth, Capernaum, and Jerusalem. Right? He's making all these trips between these two places. When the Holy Spirit is given in Acts chapter 2, the Jews who had come from other parts of the world were in the city, right? Right? So you end up with a church that's made up of Jews who lived in Palestine and many other Jews who lived in the diaspora. Right? Does that make sense? Jews who lived in Palestine and Jews who lived outside Palestine. Right? Now, Jesus' ministry has been largely with Jews who lived in Palestine. Right? But in Acts 2, these Jews who lived in Palestine meet with the Jews who had come from around the world. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right? So, now the ministry of Jesus has to speak to Jews not only from Palestine, but Jews from, in Luke's words, around the world. All right? Slowly, we begin to see the Jews who had come from around the world begin to grow in number in this church. Right? So when we get to Acts chapter 6, the Jews who had come from outside Palestine have now begun to actually have influence on decisions going on in the church. Right? That's why they say, you are ignoring our widows. Right? And in response, the apostles say, choose you men who can take care of that business, and we continue to devote our time to the word and to prayer. Right? Acts chapter 6. Are we together? From then we begin to see that the part of the church that were of Jews from outside Palestine continues to grow. Actually, all the deacons who were selected in Acts chapter 6 have Greek-sounding names, which makes it possible that these people were actually from the diaspora. Right? These were Jews who had come from outside. 7 is the story of Stephen. Again, Stephen, it's not necessarily a Jewish name, so he may be from somewhere in the diaspora. 8, Saul enters the story, right? Then persecution begins. 9, Saul is converted on the way to Damascus. 10, Peter's vision of the cloth with animals coming from heaven, right? 11, they are beginning to, so first part of 11, Peter is back in Jerusalem, is reporting about what happened, that the Holy Spirit fell on a Gentile, right? And then it's something interesting. The Jews have been dispersed from Jerusalem and they're beginning to convert Gentiles, right? So it's no longer just Jews from Palestine, Jews from the diaspora. From Acts 11, we begin to see Gentiles join the body. Am I making sense? Right? Is this making sense?
Yes. Yes.
And then Paul joins the story here again because Barnabas goes to Tarsus and brings Paul back to help leadership in the church. Acts 12 We are back in Jerusalem. Peter is taken to prison, Peter and James. Acts 13, we are back in Antioch, right? And the Holy Spirit shows up and says, send Paul and Barnabas to take the gospel to the Gentiles. And from then on, the story begins to focus on Paul's work. All right? You get me? Acts 13, they go on the first mission trip. Acts 14, they go on another mission trip. Acts 15, they go back to Jerusalem to discuss what do we do with Gentile Christians. Do we need them to become Jews, or can they remain Gentile and be Christian? Right? We mentioned this yesterday. Acts 16, from Acts 16 to the end of the story, to the end of Acts, really it becomes the story of Paul. Right? Actually, in Acts 16, the person who is writing the book of Acts, Luke, he begins to use the language of we, as if he is part of the story, as if he is actually traveling with Paul. Right? So we got to Troas, or we got to do this, or we got to do this. He is part of the journey, right? And so he stays with Paul up until the end of the book of Acts, right? When you look at that story, it will make you think that this is how Christianity develops right from the start. That actually it's going with Paul, actually going towards Rome, right? But this is just one of the many stories of how the church spread. Am I making sense? This is just one of the stories. When the church was born in Jerusalem, it spread in all directions. It's not just going in one direction towards Rome. It goes to India, it goes to Persia, it goes in all directions. What we have in Acts is just one line of the story. Am I making sense? Yeah. It's one line of the story that actually really is focused on Paul, because the person who is writing the book is with Paul. But there are many other people, the other disciples, the other apostles went in different directions. And they did just as great things as Paul is doing as he's going towards Rome. Right? Does that make sense? Okay. And one of those stories will be the story of the beginning of the church in Africa. Again, not written in the Bible, but it's part of the story. All right. So, some of the books that tell this story are those two books written by one person, an American. I get my students to read the first one, the one on the left. How Africa shaped the Christian mind. And then actually the more fascinating story is the African story of Mark. Because Mark, as I said, Mark was born in Cyrene, in Libya. He grew up in Cyrene. Basically, he's an African Jew, right? Okay. His cousins with Barnabas. So when Paul is going on the first mission trip, they take him with them, and he leaves them along the way, right? And when they have to go to the next trip, Paul says, we cannot take John Mark with us, right? But John Mark was already, I mean, he was a young man, but was already quite active in the story, right from the start. As I said, the church is really born in his house. Right? The upper room is in his mother's house. He is really part of the story. Now, Mark would then come back to Africa to start the church.
Orthodox Church, the patron saint is Mark.
Yes. He will be the first Pope, Patriarch of the Orthodox Church. He comes back to first goes back to his home in Cyrene, and then he goes to Alexandria. Alexandria being the second largest city in the Roman Empire, and actually the second most important city. Rome is the capital, that's where everything is happening. Alexandria is the second most important city. And so John Mark, what's his full name? He goes to Alexandria. And in Alexandria, he suggests some books of the story of the African church, so African church history. They say when he entered the city, this is how the story is told, that basically he performed a miracle on somebody who was trying to fix his shoe. And that miracle led to the church being planted in Alexandria. And then he would become the first bishop of Alexandria, taking care of the church in Alexandria. And that church, again, goes on until today. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. It will be probably from this place in Alexandria that he writes the Gospel of Mark. That would then, and he writes the Gospel really because he has learned the story from Peter. But that Gospel, as I said earlier, will be the original document that both Matthew and Luke use to write their Gospels. Again, important, that actually this is happening in Africa. Right? That this chap in Northern Africa provides the resource, the original resource that will be foundational to both Matthew and Luke. The fact that actually it's a miracle that leads to this again says something about the worldview, right? That by performing this miracle, he is wrestling with the spirit world. That actually draws people in. So he becomes the first bishop of the church in Africa. He plants the first church. He becomes the first bishop, and therefore, really, is quite an important part of the story. we know that Paul and Peter would end up in Rome, and Peter would be the leader of the church in Rome. That's why the Roman Catholic Church calls him the first pope of the church, as in he becomes the bishop of Rome. But it's Mark who becomes the bishop of Alexandria. They are the disciples. But really, I mean,
Strange.
Matthew was a tax collector, right? Before he became a disciple. So somewhat educated, but in a different context. Possibly Mark is growing up in North Africa, Cyrene, Alexandria, and as I said, Alexandria was a university town. So possibly it's that helps him decide to say, okay, I need to put this story together. And so he creates that story. A lot of people say that it's Peter's telling of the story, only that Peter could not write well, so he gives it to Mark to write. Right. Again, Mark was a younger boy then, so he becomes sort of an errand boy for the disciples for a bit. So he gets to sit down with Peter and take the story from Peter and make it the gospel. So Matthew will take it, and I think almost all of Mark is found in Matthew. Right?
So maybe just Matthew and John were just too old to remember everything.
Yeah, it's possible. Yeah. John will write a different kind of gospel, and much later, right? But Matthew picks it up really quickly, expands Mark to become the gospel of Matthew, and Luke uses it, but Luke uses it while he is also telling his own story, because he is writing that so he can write Acts to continue the story. Right, shall we move forward? Just out of interest. Again, interesting church history. When Mark died, he was actually martyred. He was killed in Alexandria. Some people were not happy with the growth of the church in the city. So he was killed in Alexandria, buried in Alexandria. After some centuries, the Romans from Venice came and took his yes, and took it to Venice in Italy. And so he was there for a long time. There was a time when actually the Romans were obsessed with collecting the bones of the apostles, so that they could be in Italy, or in Constantinople, in Istanbul. And so they
Yeah, we'd like to understand who killed Mark.
Oh, it's just
Who killed Mark?
Mark was killed by a mob in Alexandria.
Mm-hmm.
Just a bishop that some people didn't want to have a church in Alexandria, so they murdered him. Yeah. So that image is about the relics, the bones of Mark being brought back to Egypt, 1968. So now the body rests in Egypt as an important figure who started the church in Egypt. Are we together?
Yes.
Now, just to go through a bit of this story. We have talked a lot about Mark, right? His other name is John Mark. We've talked a lot about Mark. He was born in Cyrene in Libya. He is very much an important figure in the story. He writes the first gospel. He does he becomes the first bishop of Alexandria. But don't forget that really he was born and he grew up in Africa, right? He's an African Jew. When we go back to Acts chapter 13, where the Holy Spirit comes up and says, "Send Paul and Barnabas for me, so they can go and preach the good news to the Gentiles." There are 5 leaders mentioned in the church in Antioch. Right? Are you with me?
Yeah.
Barnabas, who we have met, we know that he was one of the Jews who were born and grew up outside Palestine, right? We know he was born in Cyprus. Okay? So, that's an important part of the story. He's one of the diaspora Jews helping found the church in Antioch. And possibly he's the only one who could do this among the leaders because he was of the diaspora himself, right? And then there's a person called Simeon who was also called Niger, right? And Simeon is called Niger because he's a black man. All right? He's black, just like you and me. He's one of the leaders in Antioch. And then there is Lucius of Cyrene. Again, another African. Right? Don't forget, Cyrene is in Libya. So again, another African is in the leadership in Antioch. And then there's Manaen, who was a close friend of Herod the Tetrarch. And then Saul. 5 leaders. Out of those 5 leaders, one is black, and there is another African. Does that make sense?
I want to, sorry, what is Maghreb? Moy,
Manaen.
Egypt and
No, Manaen is not. Manaen is what they tell us about Manaen was that he was a friend of Herod. So he is part of the leadership, but he has nothing to do with Africa. It's Simon or Simeon, who is called Niger, and Lucius of Cyrene. These 2 are connected with Africa. This is Antioch. This is the 3rd largest city, 3rd most important city in the Roman Empire. And you have these 2 Africans in senior leadership. All right? But also, in Acts, in the letters to the Corinthians, there's a man called Apollos, right? And Apollos was from Alexandria. Yep. He shows up, I think it's Acts 19, and Aquila and Priscilla have to take him in and teach him. He was eloquent, he was educated, but he did not know the full gospel. So Aquila and Priscilla take him in and teach him. Becomes a key figure. When there is conflict in the church in Corinth, people are divided between Paul, Apollos, and others say we follow Christ. He is that important. Right? And he comes from Alexandria, he comes from Egypt. Now, yesterday I did mention the fact that it's against Simon of Cyrene, and this is different from Simeon the Niger, right? Simon of Cyrene, who helped carry the cross of Jesus. And when you say of Cyrene, think of an African. Libya. Right. His two sons, Alexander and Rufus, again play a very important role in Paul's missionary journeys. Paul has this group of people that work with him, right? Timothy, Silas, and all these others. And once in a while he mentions Alexander and Rufus. And I think it's in the letter to the Romans where he says, greet their mother, who is also like my mother. But they are from Libya. Right? Does that make sense? Now, what does this say? You have to be intentional about how you read the story. Somebody can read the story and not see Africa at all in all this. Same story. Right? But when you know what you're looking for, you will find it. So when you look for Africa in the story, when you look for Africa in the New Testament, you will find it. When you look for Africa in the story of the beginning of the church, it's there, you will find it. Again, we are not a correction that is made later to fit into the story. We are an original part of the story. We were part of the story right from the beginning. An African wrote the first gospel. We were part of the story right from the beginning. We are not an addition that happens later. Now, this, I'm taking it a little deeper. Because now I'll give you history that happens after the New Testament, right? That happens after the last book of the New Testament has been written, which is most likely the Gospel of John and Revelation. And those are written very much towards the end of the 1st century. After that, we begin to see that Africa continues to play a very important role in the shaping of Christianity. I told you earlier about the Bible school, the school of theology, that John Mark started in Alexandria. Right? And again, I mean, there's a lot that we could talk about that. That it's in Africa that this thing happens. Okay? And many leaders of the church in the first 600 years are trained at this school in Egypt. And they will go on to write important books about Christianity from Egypt. So let's be aware of this. The three names on the third bullet point, Clement, Origen, and Athanasius, are some of the most important names coming out of the Bible school in Alexandria. Right? Clement was much earlier. Origen, quite an important figure. Athanasius, we will talk about Athanasius in a bit. But these are leaders who live in Alexandria and shape Christian theology probably more than anyone else in that time. Right? Now, I showed you the map of the Roman Empire, and I showed you how the Roman Empire covered parts of North Africa, right? So, of course, whatever is happening in Alexandria is part of the Roman Empire. But the church in Alexandria spoke Greek. It was shaped by Greek language, Greek thought systems. There grew a church in Carthage, which is in Tunisia, that spoke Latin. Right? And Latin, when they spoke Latin, they were speaking Latin as their vernacular, as their mother tongue. It's not, at this point in time, it's not a privileged language at all. It's just, we live in this part of the world, therefore we speak Latin. Right? The guys in Alexandria are speaking and writing their theology in Greek. The people in Carthage will do the same, but they will do it in Latin. Right? And one of the most important names in that story in Carthage is Tertullian. While there were people like Clement writing theology in Greek in Alexandria, right? Tertullian becomes the first person to write theology in Latin. And therefore, actually people call him the father of Latin theology. And actually some extend that to say he is the father of Western theology. Is this making sense? Right? He is an African, a very important theologian, very, 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 very important. He is the first theologian, again, to write in Latin, but he is the first one to begin to articulate what we call the theology of the Trinity in Christianity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It's Tertullian. It's happening in North Africa. It's not in Rome, it's not in Canterbury, it's not in Berlin, it's not in any European city. It's happening in Carthage, in Africa. Right? Another important figure is Cyprian, who would become the Bishop of Carthage after Tertullian, much later. That actually, again, stands out as a very important Christian leader in Carthage, in Africa. Right? And really, possibly the most important Christian theologian of the past 2,000 years is Augustine. And again, Augustine is in Carthage. His mother was a black African like you and me. Very, very, very important theologian. Like, there's really no theology without Augustine. But he is in Carthage, right? Becomes the bishop of Hippo, a town in Tunisia. Now, actually, for all this period that I'm talking to you about, you do not find any European theologians. They don't exist yet. The theology of the early church is made in Africa. Does that make sense? The theology of the early church is made in Africa, both in Greek, in Alexandria, and in Latin, in Carthage. European theologians will come up later. Any questions? Or reflections, really? When you hear this, what's coming to you? What's going on in your minds? Really, again, we cannot tell that story faithfully without recognizing that Africa was present. Okay, the question is whether the first church came from Rome. It did not. The church is born in Jerusalem, right? Acts chapter 2. And then it spreads from there to
from those 10 tribes.
No, those 10 tribes were already scattered. They were gone, right? It's the so okay. Let me back up a little. The Romans, Rome was the center of the capital, right? Or the capital of the empire, right? Rome was the capital of the empire. This is where everybody came to. Like this is where the power is. Paul, when he writes his letter to the Romans, he has never been to Rome yet. So he did not start the church in Rome. The church in Rome was already there when Paul arrived. Right? Okay. But the story I'm telling is about the spread of the church from Jerusalem, not from Rome. The Rome will become an important Christian city 400 years later. Right? Rome really becomes important in this story. It becomes very important after the empire has adopted Christianity as its religion. And that happens 400 years later. Right? So, for a great deal of the time before Rome becomes this important city, Christianity is just simply, and it's actually persecuted and marginalized in the empire. And therefore, it's these hidden communities in every city and in every village, in the empire and beyond. Right? Rome doesn't really begin to play a serious role until much later. Yeah. It's Jerusalem that really begins the story. Antioch sends Paul and Barnabas. Mark ends up in Alexandria. But the apostles go in different directions. There is a Christian community today in India that claims that Thomas, the apostle Thomas, the disciple Thomas, is the one who started that church 2,000 years. Right? But they say Thomas started this church. And really that is to say the apostles went in different directions. What we see in the New Testament really focuses on Paul. Because, as I said, half the book of Acts is about Paul. But the majority of the New Testament is written by Paul. But while Paul is doing this, and Peter is doing this in Rome, Thomas is in India. Right? Matthew is doing something somewhere else. Bartholomew is doing something else somewhere else. The church was scattered in all directions. It's not just in one direction. Now, again, I'm intentionally leaving out all that story and focusing on the story in Africa. Right? Highlighting how Africa is important in this story right from the start.
So, what do you mean to say Roman Africa?
Yes. The part of North Africa that was in the Roman Empire was called Roman Africa. Does that make sense? When you look at the map again, when you take it back. That's about the spread of Christianity, but really that's the empire. When you look at that map, you can see Egypt all the way to Morocco, right? The red part is part of the Roman Empire. And so this part of Africa, Northern Africa, which is part of the Roman Empire, was called Roman Africa. So when Islam emerged, right? Early 600 AD, 600 AD, 622, 632. When it emerged, part of its original goal was to take over all the land, especially in North Africa, that was controlled by the Romans. So, of course, they took Jerusalem first, and then they took Alexandria, Egypt. And of course, once they come in, get rid of Christianity, bring in Islam. And they systematically took one village, one town after another, from Egypt all the way to Morocco. Right? By 700 AD, they were in Morocco and they crossed over into Spain. And once they took North Africa, established Islam in these places, persecuted Christians, get rid of Christianity in most of these lands, make the culture Arabic, right? And so that is the story until today. That this part of the world, that again, as you've seen the history, right? It's a very important part of Christian history. That we cannot really tell the story of African Christianity. We cannot really tell the story of Christianity. We cannot tell the story of how theology became theology without acknowledging Tertullian in Carthage, right? Without acknowledging Augustine in Carthage, without acknowledging Athanasius in Alexandria. But all that history was wiped out after Islam showed up. Yes? And that's why we need to be talking about these things, right? So we can know how to respond when that happens. Yeah. Right. So I'll talk about Athanasius in a bit, but Athanasius was known as the Black Dwarf because he was black and he was short. And this is one of the most important leaders of the church. Very, very important figure. But he's a black African. So the Arabs came with Islam. Right? Now, these names will be recognized in church history. Right? Whether it's Tertullian or Augustine, these are names that we still study in church history. But the problem is, we study them as if they're Europeans. Right? And this is common. When people learn about Augustine, they learn about him as if he's a European. Right? Of course, his father was a Roman, but his mother was a black African woman. Okay? And his mother is very, very influential to his theology. But we study him as if he's a European. Tertullian, when you discover that he's an African, for most people it's already too late. Because we study him as if he's a European. Keeping our history away from our knowledge. So we don't know what our people have done before. Right? Does that make sense? These are Africans. They're not Europeans. But when you study church history, in most places, in most universities, it will look like they are Europeans. Because, of course, nothing good can come out of Africa, right? And that's a lie.
The portraits of white people. The portraits.
Yes.
White people.
Yeah. Now, when I teach this course to my students in the UK, I make sure to point out to them that actually, during the time of the Roman Empire, there were 3 popes of the Roman Catholic Church who came from Africa. Right. I know that for the past few years, when the Pope died, people thought, they're going to replace him with an African. And some people are actually saying, this would be our first African Pope. But no, there have been African Popes before. There has been a black Pope before. So, those are names and sort of their official portraits. But as you can see, that's 1500 years ago. Right? Again, all I'm trying to do is to show you that Africans have played an important role in this story. Let me take you back to Alexandria. I did mention that the church in Alexandria spoke Greek, right? And the Greek, Alexandria spoke Greek because of the Greek history of the city. The city itself was founded by Alexander the Great. Right? And he wanted it to be sort of an education center, a university town with a big library. And yes, that happened. Okay. So a great deal of Greek theology, Greek theological conversations happened in Alexandria. But when the local people who did not speak Greek caught the gospel, right? You end up with a church, again in Egypt, that is using a local Egyptian language, the Coptic church. The Greek-speaking church would be now known as the Greek Orthodox Church, and it has sort of a daughter church called the Coptic Church, where people are speaking in Copt, a language of the Egyptians. Right? Now the Coptic Church has again existed from the beginning of Christianity until today, with millions of members around the world. It is, I would say, maybe a tribal church, in that you have to speak Copt in order to belong, right? Which is, you remember yesterday I said the translation from Greek, from Hebrew to Greek, right? Happening in Antioch, and later on from Greek to Latin, and Greek to German, right? For the Coptic church, and we will talk about the Ethiopian church in a bit, but for the Coptic church, that translation doesn't happen. So it continues to be a Coptic church until today. We have a Coptic congregation in Liverpool. Still Copt. Even now, for the kids who, like in Liverpool, they speak English, church still has to happen in Copt.
So do you mean even Alexander was speaking the Copt language?
No, Alexander was speaking Greek. So there's a Greek-speaking church in Alexandria and the area around. But for the rest of Egypt, they are speaking Copt, which is a local language.
So they use just local language.
Sorry?
So they focus on local language.
Yes. It's almost like the Arabs control Dar es Salaam, and the church that emerges in Dar es Salaam speaks Arabic, and then the church that emerges in the rest of the country here speaks Swahili, which is a local language, right? That's what happens with Alexandria. Around the city, They speak Greek. And they take pride in their Greek, right? Because, again, as I said, the city was founded by Alexander himself. It's a very important city in the Greek-speaking world. But beyond the city, the gospel reaches people who don't speak Greek. They speak Copt. So the Coptic church begins. The Orthodox church continues in Alexandria, but there is a big Coptic church that emerges, speaking Copt as their language. And as I said, that continues until today. They also claim that actually Mark is the person who founded their church. They still claim that Mark is their first pope, right? But they have continued. I think today they have their 118th pope or something like that, somewhere around 1700, 1819. Am I making sense? So, yes. Greek-speaking church around Alexandria, Copt-speaking church for the rest of the country, and don't forget Latin-speaking church in Carthage. All this is North Africa. So I'm teaching with the PowerPoint, I'm not teaching to the notes, but everything I'm saying will be in the notes. Again, just books that tell you the story of the Coptic church. I'll make sure that you have the PowerPoint. The word Copt itself is Greeks trying to say Egypt, however they pronounce it, and it becomes Copt. I can jump over this one. Let me tell you a bit about the church in Egypt, especially the Coptic church. It is, again, a very important church in that it plays a very important role in the development of Christianity. Just like today, these Christians in Egypt, actually let me rephrase that. First thing about the Coptic church, actually about the church in North Africa, about the church in Egypt, is that these people, right from the start, were committed to doing theology. And therefore, speaking up against heresy. You know what heresy is? Speaking. Yes. They were spending a lot of energy writing against wrong doctrines. Right? And really, that's how their theology emerges. they hear about somebody who is teaching wrong things about Jesus, and they will write up books and letters to try and show why that person is wrong. Right? And they did this many times, such that it becomes part of their, not just their contribution to Christianity, but part of their characteristics. They are Christians who fight against heresy. All right, you hear me, right?
Yeah.
Making sense? I'll come back to fighting against heresy in a bit. But another key important aspect of North African Christianity is that they embraced martyrdom. They embraced the fact of being killed for the sake of the gospel. Again, for them, even until today, right? For them, dying for Christ is normal. It's a normal part of the Christian journey. Very important. It's not a Christianity that's fighting for power. It's a Christianity that's able to lay down its life for the church. Tertullian, that theologian I mentioned, is remembered to have said, the blood of the saints, when they have been killed, is the seed for the church. Well, quite important. The blood of the martyrs is the seed for the church. Okay? And the third thing, they were big on mission. Now, their mission is interesting because it's different from what we think of mission today. Right? Their mission was really about setting up monasteries. Get away from the city, go into the deserts, Egypt, right? They're going into the desert. They go into the desert and they set up monasteries. And once you set up a monastery, people come to learn from you. So you disciple others, right? It's making disciples. But you disciple others in the context of your monastery. And then they grow, they develop, they then go and set up their own monasteries. And they disciple others. Right? And that becomes a whole missionary movement. Does that make sense? Okay? You understand? Theology, fighting against heresy, 1. 2, dying for Christ. And 3, mission, monasticism.
You have mentioned 3 things. The 3 things you have mentioned.
Yes. Fighting against heresy. So theology. Martyrdom. Embracing the realities of dying for Christ. And mission through monasteries. And that model of mission, this is long before the current model of sending missionaries to other parts of the world emerged, right? this model of mission, of setting up monasteries, was taken up by the Europeans. And so, for a long time then, Europeans would also set up monasteries as a way of doing mission. That's why you find many cities in Europe named after missionaries. Saint Paul, Saint this, and Saint that, Saint Gallen. Most of these started as monasteries, where one missionary goes, Saint Columba, one missionary goes, and a group of people come, and it becomes a missionary station. Yeah, make sense? You understand me? Now, as we said yesterday, part of the concerns about a great deal of the mission that happened in the 1800s and the 1900s was its connection to colonialism, right? So what we see here in these missionaries going up and setting monasteries is really a model of mission that's not about colonizing. It's different. It's a different model that actually brings together community for Christ. Am I making sense? So when you read this history, when you have time to read this history, you will hear of people like Saint Anthony of Egypt. Anthony started a monastery. Actually, he wasn't even starting a monastery. He just went to be alone in the desert to pray, and in his own language, to fight the devil where the devil lives, in the desert. You remember, Jesus talks about when a demon gets out of a person, it wanders around in the deserts, right? Anthony reads that and concludes that actually the demons live in the desert, right? So he goes to the desert to fight against the devil in the desert, right? And for him, the more alone he is, the more he is devoted to God and to his mission. So actually Anthony would later on be proud to say he stayed for 20 years without seeing a human face. 20 years alone. People in the village knew that there's Anthony in this cave, and they would come in and throw food for him. Right? But he stayed for 20 years without seeing a human face. He stayed in that place for almost 85 years. Think of it. 85 years of living in isolation in a monastery. 85 years. And yet, again, he is one of the most important leaders in the story of Christian mission. Not because he was a missionary in the way we understand mission today, but because he went out there. Yes, of course, he was deeply involved in spiritual warfare, but he would gather groups of disciples around him. And those disciples would gather other disciples. And those disciples would gather other disciples. There was a time in this story that there were more than 100,000 people living in the deserts in monasteries at one point in time. These people are now, when we study them, we call them desert fathers and desert mothers. They're the fathers of African Christianity, the mothers of African Christianity, who did not want to live in the city. They went to live in the deserts. Not because they're running away from the city, but because they want to fight the devil right where the devil lives. Important. Am I making sense? The monastic model of mission is just a model among many other ways of doing mission. Yes, and the Catholics have stuck with it. They still do that until today. But there are many other ways of doing mission. In the West at the moment, even evangelical Christians like us are beginning to go back to monasteries as ways of making disciples. So it's not just a Catholic model. And really, actually, as I'm showing there, it does not begin with the Roman Catholic Church, right? It's beginning in Egypt, away from Rome. In a book that I published just last year, I talk about how Paul, in the book of Acts, has his mind set on, I want to preach in Rome. Right? This begins in Acts 18. When he makes up his mind, this is around this time is when he writes the book, the letter to the Romans. Right? And he wants to preach in Rome. So, when he begins to go to Jerusalem, where he will end up being arrested and taken to Rome, right? Prophet Agabus shows up, and these communities try to slow him down, try to convince him, don't go to Jerusalem, right? Paul is made up his mind, I will go to Jerusalem so I can end up in Rome, right? While these people, Anthony, Paul, another Paul of Egypt, Pachomius, and there are many of them. As I said, there were hundreds and thousands of desert fathers. They intentionally are moving away from the powers of empire to go into the deserts where the empire is not interested in them. Right? So it's just a model, and it's a model that actually evangelical Christians are beginning to use now. In the context of individualism, is that easy to translate into Swahili? Individualism.
Kwenye mazingira ya ubinafsi au mimi.
Okay. So in this world, in the West, where people are very individualistic, community is difficult, right? That's why I said people are dying of loneliness. And that is why people are saying, let's form communities again. About the question about the day of St. Gabriel. That's okay, I think. I just wanted to get the individualism part properly translated. But we need to understand that it's been 2,000 years of this history. And if it's 2,000 years, it's one generation after another generation, after another generation, after another generation, right? And things shift from generation to generation, right? One. Two, it's common in Western Christianity, especially in the Orthodox Church, to have days to remember and celebrate important people in the story of the church, right? So almost all the key figures in the history of the church, in that sense, have their days where people celebrate them, right? And possibly the Gabriel that they are celebrating is not the angel. Maybe it's one leader in the church, Saint Gabriel, that they commemorate on this day. And the people that talk to you think it's about the angel, but it could be just a bishop somewhere. So let's not come to quick conclusions. I think that's important. 1:15. Let me try and rush through this bit, and then we can pick it up afterwards. I've talked about three things, right? Monasticism, martyrdom, and fighting against heresies. The Roman Emperor Constantine became a Christian in 312 AD. Now, there is a lot of debate as to whether he really became a Christian, but he came close to the church. He will not be baptized up until 25 years later, when he was dying, which again, for them at the time was normal. They want to baptize people when they know that they're not going to commit any more sins, so they can go to heaven, right? But when Constantine became a Christian, Christianity had been growing slowly in the empire for 300 years, right? From the time of Christ. So it is, people say it was around 10% of the empire's population, right? Constantine himself became a Christian because he says when he was going to war, he saw a cross in the sky and heard the voice of Jesus telling him, use this to conquer your enemies. Use the cross. And so he taught his army to write the cross on their swords and their shields. And when he won that war, he said, the God of the Christians has helped us do this, right? So he begins to favor Christianity. He stops the persecution of Christians and makes Christianity one of the legal religions in the empire. It's not outlawed anymore. You can be a Christian in the empire, really, for the first time. But he had one problem on his hands. The Christians in the empire were not united. Right? And because the Christians were not united, the empire was not united. You hear me, right? And therefore, he had to do something about it. Now, while this is happening, while Constantine is trying to find ways to unite the empire. Back in Africa, in Alexandria, something happens. An elder in the church begins to preach that Jesus was created. That there was a day when Jesus did not exist. And God created Jesus. Now, of course, as Christians, we know that that's not right, right? God is eternal, and Jesus is eternal with God, right? But this leader in Egypt, his name is Arius, A-R-I-U-S. Let me see if I have it here. Okay. All right, I'll go back to this one. Arius is preaching that Jesus was created. And the Bishop of Alexandria is not happy. And he has a young man, and his name is Athanasius. He's not happy either. Right? This heresy by Arius is threatening to divide the church in North Africa. Okay? So Constantine decides to take advantage of this situation. And what does he do? He says, call all the bishops together to a place called Niger in Western Turkey today, so that we can discuss this. Right? Now, by calling all the bishops to come together, actually, Constantine is using an African model. The church in Africa, in North Africa, had already been meeting in these councils so they can discuss the issues to do with the church. Constantine takes that and says, let's come together to Nicaea to iron this out. And so they get together, the bishops, at least 300 of them, from around the empire. They meet in the palace. So this is the emperor's house, right? And the emperor himself, Constantine, is there in the meeting. He opens it. He claims himself to be the 13th apostle. Jesus had 12. He adds himself to become one of us as emperor and as servant of God for the church, right? And he says, let's sort this issue out. What comes out of that council is that Arius is condemned. All his books are burned. And Arius is sent to exile. Right? The emperor is in charge of this. But most importantly, they say, let us come out with a creed that we will be using throughout the church, so that the heresy like that of Arius does not creep back into the church. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So, of course, then we have what we now call the Nicene Creed. You know what I'm talking about?
Yes. I believe.
Yes. I believe in God the Father, right?
Yeah.
And by saying that I believe in God the Father, I believe in Jesus Christ, His only Son, we are making sure that whatever Arias said doesn't come back into the church. You get it, right? The emperor himself is overseeing this business. Let's create a creed. When we baptize people, they have to declare this. I believe in God the Father. I believe. Credo, right? I believe. Such that nobody can later come up and say, Jesus is not the Son of God. Because you have already declared, I believe in Jesus Christ, the Son of God. You get me, right? Now, please notice that this whole business is happening because of stuff going on in Africa. Right? It's theological issues going on in Alexandria that lead us to this place where we have now to create a creed that all Christians around the world are now reciting. And the person at the center of the creation of this creed is Athanasius, the black dwarf. You hear me? It's Athanasius of Alexandria, the black short man who leads this process. Does that make sense? Questions, comments? We have 5 minutes before lunch. There are many creeds. The Nicene Creed being the most recognizable and maybe the most important shared around the world. But the Nicene Creed is building on the Apostles' Creed, right? That had been circulating before. It's take that, make it respond to Arius, that gives us the Nicene Creed. But the Nicene Creed itself will go through several revisions before it gets to a place that we recite today. For example, of course, in Nicaea, the main questions that they were wrestling with were about Christ and Christ's relationship with God. Is Christ God or not? Right? In Greek language, they are wrestling with whether Christ is of the same substance as God. And that does not translate well into English. But these are the issues that they're wrestling with. Is Christ of the same substance as God? Or is he of a different substance? Right? But their focus is on Christ. Later on, 381 AD. So Nicaea is 325 AD, right? 381 AD, they come back. After several attempts, they come back and they want to answer the question of, so where is the Holy Spirit in this whole story? How does the Holy Spirit relate with God? And how does the Holy Spirit relate with Jesus? Okay? And so they add a short phrase that talks about the Holy Spirit coming out of, proceeding out of the Father and the Son. Right? In the creed. That the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. They add that to the creed, sorted, done. But that creates a problem, especially for the Egyptians, for the Orthodox Church in Egypt, Coptic, Greek speaking, to the point that in 451 AD, I have it there. In 451 AD, where I have the red, in the Council of Chalcedon, the Egyptians said that we are no longer part of this whole Roman-led thing. They come out, they form their own, right? Now, when we study church history, we talk a lot about the breakup that happened in 1054 AD between the Catholics and the Orthodox Church, right? But long before 1054 AD, long before the Catholics and the Orthodox Church separated, it was the Egyptians who left first. And the issues around both the Egyptians leaving and especially the Orthodox leaving have to be connected to that simple statement that the Father, that the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. It feels, to the Greek-speaking church, it feels like you're saying the Holy Spirit is subordinate, is below the Father and the Son. But again, we know that it's the Trinity, it's Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, one God, right? So if you make it subordinate, it creates problems for other people. And so the Orthodox Church moved out because of that, 1054. Does this make sense? Again, the Nicene Creed, the whole Nicene Council, is really a response to drama going on in Africa. And yes, Athanasius Creed. He's an African chap, black and short, who has this oversized importance in the Christian world. Again, if you don't know these stories, you would think it's the Europeans doing this, right? But it's people like you and me. Questions? Is this too much information? Yeah, it's part of it is lack of knowledge. They didn't know. And part of it is because they've been taught by people who made it sound like he's a European. Right? And as I said, all that history, right, whether it's Augustine or Tertullian, these are African leaders in Africa, right, that we read as if they're Europeans. As I said earlier, Europe doesn't really show up in this world of theology up until 451 AD. All this really is happening mostly because of Africans in North Africa. Does this make sense? It's part of our story. Again, we are not a later addition to the story. when people talk like Christianity has just come to Africa in the past 200 years. No! First 600 years, we are right at the center of the story. Maybe I didn't hear of them being Africans up until very late in my education.
Yeah, maybe they thought maybe we must know those people because they belong.
Hopefully.
But even when they do Saint Monica,
Yes.
the picture you get is of a white woman. But today you're telling me she was an African woman.
Monica was Augustine's mother, right?
Yeah.
A black Berber woman.
Yeah.
When you see images,
The image you see and what is portrayed is a European woman. You see a white woman. You don't see Saint Monica as an African woman.
Maybe that time was not a camera.
I like that. Yeah. But it's not just Monica. It's all those people, right? To the point that actually, even Jesus, the portraits that we see of Jesus, most of them are of a white man, blonde hair, blue eyes.
California.
Yes, from California.
Even when they talk of Saint Anthony, you don't get a vision of an African going into a desert in Egypt. You think like Saint Anthony is somewhere in Italy, in Rome.
Yeah.
But it's in Africa.
In the deserts of Egypt. Right?
I think also we hear more of Catholic Church in the history rather than Orthodox. You know, this like learning
Yes.
of Greek Orthodox is now like an eye opener because mostly we start from Roman to us, but not from the Greek Orthodox Church in Alexandria.
Yeah, and part of that is simply the fact that the stories we are still telling one another today are shaped by the West. Right? Because if you begin to engage the East, you hear more about the Eastern Orthodox Church, you hear more about the Coptic Church, you hear more about the Ethiopian Church, and those churches look totally different from everything we do in the West. These stories, we need to pay attention to the stories that we are told. Most of the stories we are told are from a certain perspective, and they want to serve a certain agenda. Right? So the whole stories of Africans are this and Africans are that, and Africans are helpless, and Africans need this, and Africans can talk, cannot do these things for themselves. They are shaped for a certain agenda. And that agenda is also in the church. So when I mean, there is a reason the New Testament focuses on Paul and not on Thomas, and not on Bartholomew, and not on Matthew, and not on any other of the leaders. Right? he has gone to Rome. He begins to center Rome in the story in ways that the others do not. Okay? A lot of literature emerged in the first 300 years of the church. How many books does Paul contribute to the New Testament? I think more than half. Yeah. Because, again, the putting together of the Bible, especially of the New Testament, is done by the Roman Empire. The canon is established, really, right after the Creed, after 325 AD. In the next 50 years, they focus on let's close the New Testament, so to speak. It's the Romans. And Paul has really made Rome important for this story. There is an agenda. When you look at these things, it may look like God is only moving in one direction towards the empire, but God is moving all around. So, again, pay attention to the information you're given, the knowledge that you're given, the things that we are told. That want us to think a certain way. The most dangerous thing you can do to a people is to guide their thinking. Right? The colonization of Africa, in which European governments were actually running governments here, that's gone. 60 years, right? But we are still wrestling with the colonization of the African mind. And that colonization of the African mind continues to keep us believing that we are not enough. 500 years of telling us you are not enough.